Okay. I mean, I think the next question I want to ask is, which measurements, I think I asked you this before, but which measurements closely correlate to what you hear?
Well, I'd have to say probably all of them, you know, one way or another. I build simple circuits. That has one other benefit, which is that the flaws will also be simple. They'll be simple to spot. There aren't a lot of exotic things going on. So if you have some odd sorts of intermodulation distortion, it'll be the same phenomena that you can typically see in a harmonic distortion waveform, or vice versa. Things correlate very nicely, and they correlate reasonably well to what you hear. But again, from my standpoint, philosophically, it's because everything is simple. Harmonic distortion, you know, versus power versus frequency versus load. Straightforward bandwidth, what do you got? And when you do have distortion, you know, what's the content of the distortion? How much is it is one important, but what the content is, what kind of harmonics, and what are the phases of some of those harmonics? Damping factor is always a favorite. Those are the first things that come up, and after that, reliability, and of course, really the fundamental thing here is, how does it sound? It's just got to sound good. And if you've listened to enough really good sounding equipment, after a while you can pick out the winners and the losers. It's not that tough.
So how important is a damping factor in an amplifier? Depends
on the speaker. Mm-hmm. If I've got a Magnepan, maybe not so much. If I have, well, in the case of these tannoys, they have too much bass because they're mounted upside down Jensen Imperial enclosures that were not necessarily designed for originally, and they have, in my humble opinion, too much bass.
There's not too much bass.
Yeah,
there's never too much bass.
Somebody wrote us up, you know, where we had these speakers at a show. Somebody, you know, had written them up and just said there was too much bass. Well, you know, what they do is they have kind of a mesa between 60 and 30 hertz, so that it goes up a number of decibel flat across, and then down again finally at below 30 hertz. So it's really very impressive. But I actually have it EQ'd down a bit, because it otherwise has, especially I don't have that large a room that they're in. It's too much bass.
Yeah, another question that I think our boss wrote here, and I think it's very interesting, is, you know, how important is using like boutique parts in an amplifier, like, you know, those, you know, expensive and boutique capacitors.
So back in the day, you could have black gates, right? And you can have, you know, so Panasonic was popular, and then you have Mundorf's, and you have, just speaking about capacitors, and then et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I don't worry too much about capacitors. I mean, of course, the best cap is none at all.
Right.
Nowadays, too, they do make some nice capacitors. I mean, when you go to buy or make a selection, I mean, the first thing you click on the tabs of under electrolytics, which are supposed to be the bad guys, is the audio grade ones, so that you can instantaneously eliminate everybody whose manufacturer is rated as audio grade. Well, there's only basically like maybe 3 outfits that do that: Nishikon, Elna, and I don't even know who the other one is. But so if you're running electrolytics, the first thing you do is you buy audio grade. These have much lower inductance. They've got they have a lower distortion. They are made for audio. Now, this didn't used to be the case. But also, particularly if you use FET circuits, you can get away with going to the higher quality film caps, of which my favorite is polypropylene. You could imagine that you can get, say, polystyrene might be better, although some people don't like that either. But in some cases, the cap becomes huge and still isn't much of a value in terms of its capacitance. So some candidates are just simply off the table. But polypropylene is my go-to for film capacitors, and I use that wherever possible. Some caps, they don't make polypropylenes beyond a few microfarads. So there will be examples of polarized electrolytics in some of the amplifiers, and in some not. They're almost always in the supply. In fact, they always are in the supplies.
So Adrian has a question here. He wants to know, how do you know if your design is getting better or worse? And really that leads to a question of what we would consider to be kind of like, what would you consider to be musical, or what is musicality, or, you know, what makes something, you know, just nice and beautiful?
Well, go back to simplicity right off the top.
Right.
And once you've achieved simplicity, you can concentrate on actually getting the distortion numbers down. There's a decent correlation when you are, you know, things work better when it's simple. So that if you are applying feedback on a simple system, it has a better behavior pattern than in a complex system. It's that old thing. Feedback is like having a credit card. It's really great if the money's in the bank. Not so great if you can't pay the bill. So the hardware has just got to be really good. Now, after that said, you know, lots of times I also get involved with using exotic parts. So there's, you know, a considerable number of, and even in just transistors. In fact, among transistors, even just FETs, there are a number of designs that have come forward since the VFET days of the mid-70s, where Sony and Yamaha were building VFETs, which are now known as SIT, static induction transistors, which are junction power FETs that are incredible because they have almost the same curves as triodes, whereas a normal FET looks more like a pentode. And all of a sudden, you have all sorts of opportunity to play with circuits that are now practical that weren't particularly practical with tubes, because you have to have all these high voltages and the transformers and everything else and the heaters. Imagine getting all of that with all that extra hardware that, you know, and you can build amplifiers with a single transistor that work quite well. I've got plenty of examples of them. So that's a fascination. If you have this simplicity and you can get it to give you some good numbers, you're almost there. And then after that, it's a question of, you know, how do you like the sound? What do you like or not like about it? And I've had some examples of things that ought to have sounded good, but it weren't, or just didn't quite cut it. But the process is almost invariably, you know, measure, listen, go back and forth. I favor sighted and blind testing. Blind testing is a lot harder to do, but of course, any results that you get blind are probably more valid. I'm not a very neutral listener. If I know what's inside the amplifier, I will tend to hear those qualities. And so for myself, I listen sighted, and I make decisions about stuff, but I try to validate this in blind testing. And it's the same in terms of the people that we also have. I'm not the only listener in the company, which is very helpful. And we are largely on the same page, though, with the tannoys, so that we, you know, try to make things as identical in terms of what our references are, so that when we talk about something, we have more in common than otherwise.
So do you find that whole process to be more of a relative kind of thing? In other words, it's not as important to be an absolute, but, you know, there at a certain stage, it's a bit too much. I find that some equipment is a bit too much. Like, I'd rather have more of a balance. And so when I play all sorts of music, it always sounds good.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can tell. the old joke about, oh, the wife in the kitchen goes, oh, honey, what did you change? There's a certain amount of truth to that. You put something in and you listen, and it's, you know, like I said, I'm biased already because I know what it is. But I have Joe Sammet one of the reasons I loved him so much as a listener was I could hand him 2 amplifiers. In fact, I wouldn't hand them to him. I would say, Joe, I put 2 amplifiers in the back of your car. I want you to take a listen to them and, get back to me. And he would come back a couple of weeks later. There are no identifiers on these amplifiers. Okay, there's no information. And on top of that, if he opened them up, he wouldn't be able to see anything that would be worth, giving him a clue. And he would come back and he would say, well, this one, oh, by the way, what he would do is he would label them A and B. He'd take his own tape and mark A and B on them so he could tell them apart. And then he'd come back and he'd go, this one is really quite good. I like this one. This one, he'd say, needs a little help. The thing was, on a couple of occasions, I handed him identical amplifiers. Well, but he came back and said, I don't know, I can't, And I went, okay, that's really good. Many of the things that we are even working on today are things where he spotted it years ago and said, that's better than that. And the opportunity wasn't there to pursue it at that time. As I said before, the whole process of designing and producing new amplifiers is very conservative and very slow. Unfortunately, Joe is no longer with us. And that is a loss, and we have to carry on as best we can. Fortunately, one thing he did do is train people for the company in terms of being able to use his process of listening, what he listened for, and how he worked with it. So we've managed to maintain that sort of thing, and we try to keep really smart, quality listeners around.
So do you have people in your companies that are like Jay, relatively young, younger than 30, who actually have a clear understanding of?
No, none of them are younger than 30. Let's see, the youngest. Well, let's see. The president of the company and Wayne are the 2 youngsters. And then there at this moment also is Mike James, who worked at Threshold. And actually, quite a few people at Past Labs had worked at Threshold, and they're still with us. And actually, and some have even retired. The years go by. And so that's the core group. After that, we've got people that we know that we lend stuff to. And the F8, for example, has been in process for 5 years. They had the J2, didn't want to be replaced by anything, and so the last amplifier that Joe actually signed off on was what we thought of then was the prototype of the F8. In the 5 years that have gone on since then, I've managed to actually improve it a bit more. So we're finally going to release that here in a couple of months.
So I think the first time I ever listened to one of your products, obviously back in the day, and I owned some of them, was Adcom, the Adcom GFA. And it's still a revered, much sought after, vintage used piece. Is that something, that kind of consultancy, is that something that you could, maybe perhaps be available for? Would you contemplate something like that? So if Jay, for instance, wanted to build an amp, could you help him out?
Oh, well, first off, what kind of amplifier did you want to build?
Well, something that you would recommend.
Well, the DIY thing is a big chunk of where my time goes, and I always recommend that. I mean, there's a big crowd of people building their own amplifiers, designing their own amplifiers also. Yep. And I put in, daily I put in at least an hour over at DIY Audio, where I've got a little flock in what's called the Past Labs forum.
So I think
unless of course Jay wants to, commercially come out with an amp and compete with me.
Oh no.
Well, Jay's already done a set of speaker cables. He's done a speaker. So he's been studying circuits, and he's studying, how to solder and all that kind of stuff. So I think an amplifier might be, on his agenda.
Oh, I've made amplifiers, but not very good ones. But anyways, moving away from myself and the topic of, but, um, I think because we're running out of time here, we'll go with the part 6, which I think is a lot of interest to a lot of our viewers here. It's titled "Advice for Audiophiles." So, if you had to choose, which would you spend most on? Which component? What would it be? Which would it be? The components? Would it be the speakers? What would it be?
Oh, I don't know. I'm the amplifier guy. I think you should spend it all on the amplifier. But in point of fact, the speaker is typically the most sensitive element in terms of differences in quality and getting what you want. The amplifiers have more similarities between them than loudspeakers by far. So I think you figure out what your speaker is and then perhaps go looking for an amplifier that's complementary to it.
I guess that, Philip, that answers the part 6 entirely, because the next question was how to choose an amplifier, but he already answered that. So,
well, I believe that there is, how do you go about, when you're choosing all this stuff, how do you go about listening? We don't really, elucidate a clear answer on that at any time. For each person, it's quite different. It can be quite different. Is there any particular slant or approach that you always use outside? You have tannoys, but is there an approach that you could recommend that would always give good results?
The best thing to do is to beg, borrow, or steal the product, get it home, and live with it for like a week or two if you can. This is where having a lot of audiophile buddies comes in handy, because you can swap equipment a little bit and you can experience other things and get a sense of what it is that you might prefer or not. Or get a dealer who's willing to lend it to you for a little bit. That really, I give people advice. They go, I've got this, I've got that, and I can always just say, well, for that speaker, there are some things I couldn't recommend offhand, and I'd be happy to tell you what they are and why. And then there's some things that I would probably lean toward trying, so as to shorten the path between that. But there are no absolutes, because so much is personal taste, and personal taste has got a really broad range. And for me, it takes me a while if something is overtly really wonderful or really awful, then the decision is pretty quick. But a lot of the time, the stuff is subtle enough that you have to live with it for a week or two before you can really make a decision. It's like my favorite listener, Joe. He didn't make snap decisions. He came back after a couple of weeks, and he was as good as it got, as far as I could see. So I live with stuff, and now that means you have to cultivate relationships that allow you to borrow equipment for any kind of a long enough period of time to figure it out. But that is part of that's part of the enjoyment of doing this. I like building a lot of different amplifiers because I enjoy the differences in sound between them. That is something that I consider to be kind of fundamental to having a good time with high-end audio. This stuff is different. If it wasn't different, who would care? And in terms of manufacturing, first watt is the other fine example. I'm not looking to have one design takes care of everything or is the last word on any subject, as far as I'm concerned. I like listening to a bad amplifier. So it wouldn't bother me at all to hook stuff up and see what happens. And if you can't tell the difference, well, then at least you don't have to spend a lot of money.
So I guess we'll move on to part 7, because Zoom is telling me right now that we're running out of time. So part 7, Adrian calls it the parting thoughts. So what is the most memorable lifelike system you've encountered?
Besides the tannoy system that you constantly use.
It's not that I don't hold it up as the most lifelike special system. You understand? It's a tool, and I don't listen to that pair for pleasure all that much. Myself, I've got a pair of SR1s, which are all Seaz drivers, in something that we did many years ago, and I still love that pair of speakers. Those are my living room speakers, and I like listening to them. They don't do anything spectacularly well, but they have just a really fine balance. They are lacking anything that bulges or sticks out that you don't like. I don't know. As I said, I like listening to bad stuff too, just by way of having the experience.
It's probably the most honest answer we've ever had on this, series.
Well, let's see. But the question was, what system impressed me? What system has impressed me the most?
Or the most memorable, like,
yes.
something that sticks to your memory, as it sounded great or something like that.
Well, I've had some interesting experiences because I've had exposure or even owned some really interesting pieces of product. Everything from ESS stuff to stacked Dayton Wrights. Joe Salmon had a pair of stacked Dayton Wrights. And in fact, he was friends with Dan DiAgostino because DiAgostino was the rep for Dayton Wright. And Joe on the West Coast had not only a stacked pair, but he kept a spare tank of sulfur hexafluoride in case they leaked. And whenever there was some problem on the West Coast, anywhere on the West with somebody having a leaky pair of speakers, Joe was the guy who would rescue them. His stacked Dayton Wrights, if you had an amplifier that would drive them, that was fairly amazing stuff. I had the Hill Plasmatronics. Never heard a top end to beat that. They were just unbelievable. And they were quite good in other ranges. In fact, actually, one of the problems here is that, lots of speakers will excel in one area and perhaps not in others. And so the experience is only partial. Let me think. I don't know. There's been a lot of speakers, and the years go by.
Okay. Can you name 5 of the best, most innovative and talented designers you've met in either speakers, electronics?
Well, let's start with electronics. I know John Curl, and he's very talented. I know Dan DiAgostino. He's very talented. I have spent some time with Bob Carver. He's very talented. I haven't spent any time with Bruno Putzis, but he's very talented. These are the people who, and there's some of the older guard, the guy, I can't remember his name, who designed that JBL amplifier, who, did such a fabulous job. There's quite a few. And there's some guys that I don't know who are very respectable. What can I say? Speaker-wise, I have always enjoyed what they put out at Magnepan. Dave Wilson is no longer with us, but there's a personality. Magico, Alan Wolf is doing great work. Let's see, Roger Sanders with electrostats. The people at Seaz making such wonderful drivers mostly ended up in either stuff that I have or the Linkwitz, Siegfried Linkwitz's stuff. Linkwitz was a fabulous speaker designer, although he never monetized his work. He just kind of gave it away. And let's see, I don't know. I knew the people at Teal. Jim Teal was terrific. I mean, these are people who understood their craft, taught me something serious at one point or another. The guys in Martin Logan for many years, it's no longer Martin Logan with them, but that was a landmark series of products. And of course, there was Peter Walker of Quad. It goes on and on. I don't know. All of them were very bright one way or another. I don't know if you could really pinpoint any one that outshone the others. Mostly I like the ones who are also nice people, which interestingly, I think they just about all are.
My experience with, I met John Curl a while back, and super nice person, very generous, and you know they all seem to be more or less like that. I mean, you are yourself, sir. So and then
Well,
there's
John is great, and I mean, he did something really lasting, which I still use all the time today, which is the quad differential FET input stage.
Mhm.
There had been a quad differential stage made before, but it was all out of other kinds of parts. And the JFETs that he used were such that they would all self-bias. So the entire front end section that was the thing that was really doing the most critical work was just those 4 transistors hooked together and no external support. Fabulous. We call it, I've been referring to it as a Curlian front end for years and years. I think that the name's starting to catch on. But he did that in, well, the first time I saw it out of him was in the Mark Levinson stuff, ML2, I believe. In any case, but all these guys have done something fabulous. You know, Bruno Putsies with the Hypex and now the Purify is absolutely at the forefront of Class D. And he isn't gonna stop. He's just gonna keep, you know, beating all the flaws out of that until finally it enters first rank. And then there's some other just incredibly brilliant people I never met. You know,
so does that say good things about our industry then? You know, the fact that there's going to be some sort of continuance.
Oh, there's, I forgot Bob Cordell and Doug Self. There's brilliant guys working. You know, when things get screwed up is when when some company decides to build it and market it. Other people enter the equation, and the brilliance of the designer may or may not shine through in those cases. But for me, this is the entertainment business. Fundamentally, I don't see it going away. People are having too much fun playing with this stuff, and that, you know, and listening to the differences in sounds and preferring some and not others. And that leaves it wide open for tubes, different kinds of new gain devices, you know, new topologies. As I said, I have found my niche, which is real simple Class A circuits. And,
so we would be remiss if we didn't ask you what 10 recordings would you be, you know, would you put at the top of your list when you're listening for, you know, characteristics, or if you're just listening for your own personal pleasure?
Now 10 is a lot. So if you
want,
a
few anyways.
Yeah, if you want, you can email our boss Adrian, and he can link. Well, I can link it in the description of this video.
Okay, why don't we do that, because I'd have to think about it. You know.
Yeah, 10 is a lot.
A lot of what I listen to all day long are things that a lot of people wouldn't, you know, recognize and might not care for it if they did anyways. And that, you know, there's a lot of lounge music. And I always define lounge loosely as, you know, guys in Paris ripping off Brazilians. And but also encompasses British doing similar sorts of things. You know, a lot of the stuff that's actually come more out of the last 20 years.
Okay, I think that pretty much covers it. But lastly, the question is, what are you most proud of accomplished in the audio world?
Well, actually, I'm really pleased to have a company that's actually still in business and making money, and that, you know, the people who work there are happy and stay for long periods of time. And, you know, there's a lot of a positive aspect about that. And it's not easy. In fact, actually, I mean, I finally, you know, treated myself and, you know, made other people run it even better than I could. But that's a source of considerable pride to you know, at this point had 50 years worth of commercial success. And that's in this business. That's not easy to do. A tremendous number of people get involved in trying to do this, and a lot of them don't make it.
Awesome. Any
Yeah,
other last
don't
questions?
take your day job. That's the way.
Philip, any last questions?
Not really. I mean, Nelson, thank you so very much. I'm truly honored to have had this opportunity to, listen to the wise, sagely words of an audio master.
Philip is about to cry.
Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure. Nice to see you again, Jay.
Nice to see you again as well. Thank you, Nelson.
Oh, we gotta do that. Don't we have to do that thing about,
what? Oh yeah, make sure to subscribe, like this video, or Adrian will kill me. Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye-bye.